Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace.
Every morning after assembly, students of Sacred Heart Girls Roman Catholic School recite the first 2 decades of the Rosary before their first class. After lunchtime, they complete the 5 mysteries by reciting the final 3 decades. There is an agreement in Trinidad and Tobago that allows the primary school to practice this Catholic prayer.
Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death.
It is the same agreement that allows children of the Charleville Asja Muslim School to say the Surah Fatiha. Guide us on the right path, the students recite, the path of those whom hath bestow thy favors. The legal rule is steeped in history and controversy. Christmas Day, 1960. An agreement is signed between the Roman Catholic Church and the then government. The document would change the face of education for an independent nation for decades to come. The words on the document signal a truce to a war deep-rooted in politics, power, race, and religion. The document is called the Concordat, and it would split a society for 6 decades. Its impact would be felt by the country's youngest. I've spent the last 2 years working on this film, drawing from years of reporting, talking to industry experts.
Check 1.
And crossing the divide.
I don't think that's a fair comparison.
It is.
Many feel the education system is at boiling point, but few could agree whether the Concordat helps or harms children. I've been trying to understand the different forces at play. So I've cast a wide net, talking to historians, past principals, educators, and denominational heads. In the next hour, they put their case forward on the Concordat. To fully understand the friction and division the Concordat has brought us to, we must go back to its inception. It's late in the year 1960. Trinidad and Tobago is still a colony. But the twin island nation has one eye fixed on an independence that is to come. Still, Premier Eric Williams is grappling with a number of domestic issues as he positions himself to be the first prime minister when independence is achieved. One of those issues is education. It's a topic Williams has a vested interest in. He had attended Oxford University in England and completed a Doctor of Philosophy in 1938. And Williams believed if Trinidad and Tobago was to succeed on the global stage, each citizen needed to have access to a sound education, and the state should provide that education. Yet Williams would find himself up against a system steeped in history. A church with such immense influence and power, his education dream would be altered. After emancipation in 1838 in a still colonized Trinidad and Tobago, it was the religious institutions, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, that began educating the country's most vulnerable. So by the time Dr. Eric Williams brought a nationalistic approach, some schools, like this one, St. Mary's College, were already around for close to 200 years.
The church is invested in education in the 1800s and in the 1900s because it was a major social development gap in Trinidad and Tobago. So we are in the position that we are in today because of an investment we made in the building up of a nation in the 18 and 1900s. And the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Hindus, the Muslims and ourselves, we have these large number of schools because there was a lack of school places at a time when Trinidad was developing.
At the start of the 60s, Williams attempted to shift that influence the Catholic Church had over education. But he would come up against Count Finbar Ryan, the Archbishop at the time. I've come to Dr. Claudius Fergus, retired senior lecturer of history at the University of the West Indies. He recalls a showdown between church and state.
Essentially, the Roman Catholic Church was the principal opponent of the PNM in those days, right? Not the opposition political party. It was the church under the leadership of Count Finbar Ryan. And it is said that, he was a real towering figure. He had reached into the Vatican itself. He held a post which would be similar to that of a member of a state council within the Vatican. So he had that kind of political clout and the backing of the papacy directly. And so Williams knew the formidable enemy that he was facing.
Count Finbar Ryan would use every means necessary to ensure the Catholic schools not only maintained its property, but also its identity. Dr. Primnath Gupta says what Finbar Ryan had seen in Guyana startled him and hardened him. Like Trinidad and Tobago, the majority of Guyanese schools in the 50s were owned and operated by the Catholic Church. Cheddi Jagan, who would go on to become Guyana's first president, stunned the church.
Cheddi Jagan was seen as a communist or socialist, whatever they prefer to call him. Most people say he was a communist. But because of his policies, he wanted free education for all. And the way he went about doing it was not in the best interests of the Catholic Church or the other churches. He decided to nationalize all schools in Guyana. The Catholic Church stood to lose the most at the time in Guyana. They were the largest and they lost a lot. There were repercussions here in Trinidad. Count Finbar Ryan was the Archbishop in Trinidad at the time, and he was determined that what had happened in Guyana should not be repeated in Trinidad.
Dr. Gupta was the principal of Tunapuna Hindu School for 15 years, and he sat on the Sanatan Dharma Mahasabha's Education Committee for 29 years. Last September, he was awarded the Hummingbird Medal Gold in the spheres of culture and education. He says Williams seemed to be headed in the same direction as Jagan. This line of thought is backed up in Professor Emeritus Carl Campbell's 1992 book, A Short History of Education in Trinidad and Tobago. Professor Campbell wrote, Dr. Williams himself was anti-clerical and opposed to denominational schools, which he stigmatized as a breeding ground of disunity. His regime reorganized the dual system since he was convinced that the churches had traditionally been supporters of the white colonial ruling class. His government reversed decisively the long-established tradition, both in primary and secondary education, for the churches to build more schools and provide more new school places than the government. Yet, Williams yielded to the church. On Christmas Day 1960, his education minister John Donaldson signed the Concordat, bowing to the church's demands. Personally, Williams may have despised the church, but politically, he needed it.
But Williams, of course, was preparing for elections the following year, and he knew that the Archbishop could be the deciding factor whether he emerged and his party emerged, as the winner of the elections or not.
The Concordat, Latin for an agreement between the Holy See, the government of the Catholic Church in Rome, and a sovereign state.
Count Finbar Ryan appointed Father Pedro Valdez to negotiate with the state, the Trinidad and Tobago Ministry of Education.
Father Pedro Valdez, that's a name that kept popping up throughout my research, like this letter, dated September 24, 1960. In this letter to the Minister of Education and Culture, John Donaldson, Father Valdez outlines each assurance the Catholic Church negotiated with the government. There were 5 requested for denominational primary schools and another 5 requested for denominational secondary schools. Some requests were radical. Clause 5 requested in Catholic schools disproportionate mixing of Catholic and non-Catholic children would be avoided, and the clerical manager would have the right to supervise the entry of non-Catholic pupils and their conduct after admission. John Donaldson rejected it. Yet, for some minor alterations, Father Valdez and the Catholic Church emerged with what it wanted. The Concordat of 1960, as approved by Cabinet, mirrored the letter Father Valdez wrote to John Donaldson 3 months before. It gave unprecedented privileges to the denominational boards. The final document had 9 clauses. It assured the ownership and right of direct control and management of all denominational primary and secondary schools to the denominational boards. If the denominational boards objected to a book being used in its schools, they were given the authority to reject it. No other religion but the denomination of the school would be taught in its classes and by teachers whom professed the school's religion. If the denominational boards opposed the appointment of a teacher on moral or religious grounds, it would stand. Then the most controversial clause. The denominational boards would have a right of 20% allocation in its secondary schools. Of the 9 clauses, this is the most infamous of the document.
That agreement was reached in the dead of night, published in 1960 on Christmas Day, when hardly anybody would be reading the Gazette. It was gazetted on that day.
Dr. Gupta says it was done so secretly, it wasn't until sometime in January 1961 the Anglican Church became aware of what had happened. Then other religious institutions found out.
My understanding is that none of the other churches ever signed the Concordat. None of them. The minister decided to offer all the other churches the same thing that was given to the Catholic Church in the Concordat, so that none of them was asked to sign a Concordat.
But a win for the Catholic Church was a win for all denominational boards. In the words of Dr. Gupta, over a period of time, precedent became law. The Education Act of 1966 extended the rights and privileges the Catholic Church enjoyed to all religious boards. But Dr. Fergus tells me the Concordat of Trinidad and Tobago was different from most others in history. In past concordats, the Vatican signed with sovereign states. It was the Roman Catholic Church that lost more than it gained.
It was an unusual kind of concordat where the state did not extract the kind of privileges and rights as in the other concordats, but actually yielded rights and privileges to the church, which should have been the domain of the state.
For one reason or multiple reasons, Williams had allowed the church the upper hand over education in Trinidad and Tobago.
What the state did was to concede to the church the right to maintain their schools, to manage the schools, to decide whether they would accept teachers that were appointed by the Teaching Service Commission or not, certain rights over the curricula and selection of textbooks, while the government took on the responsibility to train and pay the salaries of teachers, to build schools. They said 75%, but they actually built those schools. So coming out of that concordat, the church emerged stronger than it was before, whereas in the concordats that I mentioned, the church would have had to concede and therefore emerge weaker.
But while Williams would have conceded on the Concordat, he sought to compete with the denominational schools. Professor Carl Campbell wrote in A Short History of Education in Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Williams sought to correct the course of history, and he sought to do it quickly. In 1957, there were 3 government secondary schools in Trinidad. In just 10 years, the number climbed to 21, only 2 fewer than the denominational colleges. And he didn't only battle the denominational boards on schools, but also on teachers. The government had 1 teachers' training college in 1957. By 1963, it had 3 such institutions. Education in Trinidad and Tobago was at a crossroads.
How do we move forward as a nation with the government wanting a certain level of control, the church wanting a certain level of control, and the parents wanting a certain level of control. How do we move forward?
When we come back,
When they pull them pictures school right up to the net, they send all them poor to the junior sec.
education in Trinidad and Tobago reaches boiling point and explodes.
Corruption in common entrance.
Since its inception in 1960, the Concordat had caused division. While it led education stakeholders and the public at large to split in different directions, there was a growing concern that it led to inequality. Rich versus poor, important versus insignificant, black versus white. But if criticism of the Concordat was largely murmured through the 60s and 70s, it exploded with one single song in 1988.
Me a thinking fine, and me a trying to protect my child, but corruption is a constant annoyance. Going on too long in common entrance. You don't have to be intelligent, that is a lie. Your father must pull a good string with complexion high. Your child could be bright like a ball man from Laventille. Forget holy names, convent and bishops and steep.
Doc, from its inception, there seems to have been the perception that, the Concordat is unfair from all sectors of society. I mean, in 1988, Crocro sang about the corruption in the common entrance exam. Did he have a point?
He had more than a point. I used to teach in primary school at one time. I taught in primary school for a long time. And while I'm not prepared to go into any kind of details to incriminate anybody, I know for a fact there was corruption in common entrance. But I would leave it there. Crocro was right. I don't know where he got his information from, but I was an insider to what I saw happen that would best be defined as corruption in common entrance.
You believe that song was inaccurate,
Yes.
wrong, and perhaps even had racial undertones?
I'll tell you, the general perception that people had of corruption in the 20% is that the schools or the boards could just jump up a morning and come up with a list of their favorite people and say this is our 20%. And ministry has to go with that. Not so.
So Dr. Gupta, you're telling me that there isn't or has never been corruption in common entrances?
Not that I know.
The controversial Calypso might have made Crocro the 1988 Calypso monarch, but he endured a barrage of criticism in the years that followed, and the song only deepened the divide. While the religious organizations and some commentators condemned the Calypso, others congratulated him. The war went on for so long, Crocro responded to the criticism 6 years later, once again in song.
Because 6 years ago when I sang the song, they well walk the tongue and say how wrong. They say how racial and how bad. Dr. Chen and Intran Passad.
Sharon Mangru is a retired Chief Education Officer who now sits as chair of the Catholic Education Board of Management. Having worked with the Ministry of Education for over 2 decades, she witnessed the height of the controversy. I asked her if Crocro's common entrance song holds any merit.
You know, that always puzzled me because I don't know if Crocro must have known things that I didn't know. I was in the ministry for a long time. I was there for a long time. I know corruption is always possible everywhere, right? But he must have seen things that I don't know. From what I know, maybe I'm naive, maybe they never let me see, I don't know. Right? Those results come into Trinidad and Tobago, they come in under heavy police guard. It's a big deal. They go into the ministry, they stay there under heavy guard. Right? There's a place that is cleared out and that place is guarded round the clock. Right? Then the decisions are made. There's a group of people selected to work on it. They're sworn to secrecy and so on. I don't know.
Nevertheless, the battle raged on. Crocrow used the stage as his pulpit, while his opponents fired back in the press.
Me a work Ministry of Education, but this while I hear about the corruption. I cut me head and I turn me back on a bun. And just to Crocrow sit down and write this song, because I say how the junior sec is correct. But in the group, get up and get no vex. But I was never ever taking them on a trial. That's why tonight I am standing up 10 feet tall. Tell them, don't mind up and side.
Come out and apologize.
And I will open the ministry's eyes.
Come out and apologize.
But while Crocrow became the symbol of this divide, he wasn't the only one singing about the perception of corruption and how students transition from primary school to secondary school.
Children writing common entrance, some who very slow, but end up passing for seminaries just so.
I asked Sharon Mangru whether discrimination is a valid concern in the selection process.
I can't say, but what I can say is because there is not sufficient transparency. You know, we keep so many things secret. It's only the principals who see the list, for instance. The board doesn't see the list.
To understand the system by which students from primary school are allotted secondary school spots, I wrote to the Ministry of Education seeking a simulation. It's been done before. Despite an acknowledgement of my note and multiple follow-ups, I had no response. However, a source close to the Education Ministry with knowledge of the procedure provided some clarity. The first thing to understand is that the Secondary Entrance Assessment Exam is a CXC exam. CXC sets the exam and marks the papers. The criteria used to place students is broken up in four main parts: the student's performance by order of merit, their four choices, the 20% list to be picked by principals, and based on gender. First, the ministry determines the number of places that are to be filled. Let's say 20,000. 20% of those denominational places, or 2,000, will be filled by denominational boards. In this simulation, we are using 41 students in 4 schools, with each school allowed 10 students. For the benefit of this program, these names are randomly generated on a website. An online registration system automatically starts the placement of the students one by one, as it comes down the merit listing as seen on the left column. The purple column shows each child's choices in order. Schools A and B are denominational in this simulation, while C and D are government schools. The computer looks at each child's choices and tries for first choice. If spaces are available, the child is placed. If the first choice is filled up, the computer will try the child for second choice, and if there is space available, the child will be placed into their second choice. If the second choice is filled up, then the child is tried for the third choice. If space is available, the child is placed into third. If not, the child is tried for the fourth choice. When 80% of the denominational schools are filled, the computer stops placing. A principal is called in to pick his or her 20%, but does not see which students have already been placed in his school, neither do they see the scores of those they are going to select. When that is done, the computer starts placing once more. In this case, Leela Cunningham, highlighted in red, her first choice was School A, but the school is already filled, so the computer tries for her second choice to determine if there are spaces available. She is placed in School B. We continue placing in School B, and similar to School A, a principal is called in when it is at 80%. This slide shows that when all the choices are filled, Damon Phillips, highlighted in blue, cannot get into any of his choices, so the computer will now place him in one of the community schools where there are spaces available.
When the ministry comes up with a list of, let's say, 900, I'm just showing a reference, 900 names, that is for the 20%. You could have 100 children, but only 5 of them may be in that 20% list. And the ministry will not go back, as far as I know, and rescind a placement that was made for a child based on that, on your 20% list.
Yet, while the focus is on the Concordat, a crisis has engulfed the primary school system. A Joint Select Committee inquiry into the right to equal access to education with specific focus on underperformance of schools in the Port of Spain and Environs district, presented to Parliament in November 2021 showed, along with 24 state schools, 28 Roman Catholic primary schools, and 10 Anglican elementary schools were on academic watch. At the secondary level, the crisis worsened for state schools, while the pass rates for the government-assisted schools ranged from a low of 71% in 2012 to a high of 83% in 2015. Government schools plummeted to a low of 22% in 2013 and a high of 34% in 2016. The statistics are damning. In the report, the Trinidad and Tobago Unified Teachers Association revealed a consistent pattern in which underachieving schools were located in what it terms as social at-risk communities. High levels of crime, short-staffed, teacher absenteeism, disciplinary issues were among a list of factors to contribute to the underachievement. Among the committee's recommendations is that the Ministry of Education collaborates with the Catholic Education Board of Management to review the board's quality assurance program and consider implementation in underachieving schools. As the tug-of-war continues between the 20% rule, the crisis has only gotten worse. In 2003, columnist George Allen wrote an editorial labeling the Concordat a mechanism of discrimination. Many children of lower-income families were nudged aside in the application of the powers conferred by the church-state arrangement, he wrote. And those receiving the Head Start under the Concordat were instead sons and daughters of far better positioned middle and upper-middle income families. It deprived many a bright schoolchild of a deserved chance at upward mobility. Government should and must move with dispatch to deal with this cruel absurdity of privilege conferred. There must be a rethink of the Concordat, he said, not to see in what way it can be improved, but rather how quickly it can be consigned to the dustbin of history. But the denominational boards believe the 20% argument is a weak one. Reverend Joy Abdul Mohan has agreed to an interview with us at the chapel of Naparima Girls High School, one of the 5 secondary schools under the ambit of the Presbyterian Church. The moderator of the Presbyterian Synod represented the interreligious organization on the cabinet-appointed committee to review the SEA and the Concordat.
The Presbyterian Church, we have 108 churches. And out of 108 churches, we have students who will be placed on a 20% list. And only 20% out of 108 churches, meaning 20 children, will be able to attend one of our 5 secondary schools. So that's a total of 100. So that's just 20 children being provided an education in their denomination.
It's a point UWI St. Augustine principal, Professor Rosemary Bell Antwine, the then Dean of the Faculty of Law, pointed out in this televised national consultation on education in 2020.
Focusing on the Concordat, and in particular, the meager 20%, which is usually about 18 children per school, I'm told, of exclusivity, which remains in the denominational schools, is merely avoiding the real problem, and I think it's really misplaced priorities.
No business owning the property and running the business on behalf of another entity would be happy with the only concession is 20% of the intake being that you could select them. Now you have to also remember that the 20% who are selected, their parents are paying tax.
Dr. Olabisi Kaboni is a retired senior lecturer at the UWI Open Campus. She tells me all 20,000 sitting SEA students should have access to a sound secondary education.
If you start talking about 2,000 and 18,000, then you are discriminating. That is why I talk about gold standard. You are discriminating. Who came first? Who came second? Hey, the papers, say he or she came first. That one came second. That was not what was intended when Dr. Williams said 6 decades ago that what we want is for all to have equal opportunity for education. Once you start doing that kind of discrimination, you're not giving everybody an equal opportunity.
The thing is that most of the prestige schools are in fact denominational schools. And once we have that, and once we continue with the Concordat, and once we continue being the funding, we being the nation, being the funding agency for these denominational schools, I think we will perpetuate the inequality in education that we now have.
Dr. Avril Hussein is the founder of the Green Party, an organization that will like to see the Concordat removed. He lectures social and behavioral change at the City University of New York.
If you're one of the lucky 2,000 to get into what we call a prestige school, then the bulk of us are ending up in schools that are considered inferior.
Much like Dr. Hussein, Dr. Claudius Fergus feels denominational schools benefit heavily from taxpayers.
Even if the government had allowed the church to remain with the schools, they did not have to concede all of those guarantees that they gave them, with training teachers' salary, because all those things were coming out of taxpayers' money.
The government keeps saying, we are paying this and we are paying that. The government ain't paying nothing. The taxpayers, through the instrument of a government, is paying for the education of children.
A 2008 Memorandum of Understanding would see the state further commit to funding denominational schools. The Ministry of Education agreed to wholly fund repairs, renovations and construction of every school. There are 611 primary and secondary schools, of which 227 are government schools and 384 government-assisted schools.
Nothing the state gives to a school will ever suffice, because the denominational boards spend millions to maintain their schools. That subvention from the government is not enough.
Reverend Abdul Mohan tells me the government subvention is often too late, and schools like Naparima Girls must find the money to pay cleaners or carry out urgent repairs. But the question of state expenditure on denominational schools continues to be a talking point, like in this 2020 Morning Brew interview with Presbyterian Primary Schools Board General Secretary Geeta Maraj.
And for that property and that facility that we allow, and we willingly allow for our nation's children to be educated in our properties, right?
But if it's your property though, why should the state take the responsibility of maintaining it? It's your property. That's like I own a house, but I want somebody else to maintain it.
Okay, but it's not only the children of the specific denomination that's in our schools.
Yet, in many instances, the denominational boards hold the upper hand in the education system. And when we come back, we'll show you how the law may lean towards their side. The Concordat has never been far from the headlines. It might take the form of different controversies, but the Concordat has been at the heart of many of the issues facing the education system. None more so than the 2018 showdown between on-the-job trainee teacher Nafisa Naked and the Sanatan Dharma Mahasabha. Naked was assigned to Lakshmi Girls Hindu College by the Ministry of Education, but was refused entry on the school compound. School officials told her Muslims wearing the hijab are not allowed on the school premises. The Constitution and the Concordat seem to be at odds. The Constitution declares freedom of conscience, religious belief and observance. But Clause 2 of the Concordat allows denominational schools the authority to object to books or apparatus it wishes not to introduce. 7 days after the story broke, Naked was transferred to the Ministry of Rural Development, assisting in the procurement and coordination of vehicles for regional corporations across the country. Now, she's wrapping up her master's in mechanical engineering at Boston University. She agreed to talk to me on a trip back home last year.
I didn't get time to feel disappointment. I was more in shock and perhaps a bit stunned at first and numb, if that makes sense. I think from what they said to me, I didn't know how to receive that, or words like that have never been said to me before. I didn't know how to process it. So I don't think I ever felt disappointment, honestly.
The controversy had shocked her. Naked had been through the school system in Trinidad and Tobago from primary to tertiary and had never endured such barriers.
Even in my primary school, I was the only Muslim girl there. Only Muslim girl wearing hijab in an entire school. I never felt any kind of way about it. My friends never made me feel bad. Secondary school, the school I went to was very inclusive. I never felt out of place or discriminated against. University, again, for the first couple of years, I was the only hijabi in my class. But again, never felt any kind of way. So I thought, okay, this is Trinidad. Nobody's going to really care that I am a hijabi. I'm like, no, I'm 23. I've been 23 years of my life living here. Nobody ever cared then. I didn't think they would care now.
Before Naked, there was an 11-year-old girl called Samaya Muhammad. She had passed for Holy Name Convent in 1994, but the school refused to accept her wearing a hijab. Holy Name Convent was taken to the High Court in January 1995, where the applicant instituted proceedings for judicial review of the decision to suspend Muhammad. The court ruled in her favor. Muhammad reached out to Naked at the height of the controversy in 2018. The latter feels this issue will continuously pop up unless it is dealt with by the government.
Unfortunately, Ryan, I do think that I'm not going to be the last Nafisa, because this was 4 years ago and it still has not been resolved. Nothing really has come from it in terms of concretized laws or action that needs to be taken. So I'm not going to be the last. There is going to be another girl like me, maybe 10 years from now or 15 years from now, who's going to go through the same experience. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that there's anything that I or people who happened to before can do about that.
It's a recurring decimal, just different situations. In September 2004, 12-year-old Khalifa Logan was denied entry to St. Charles High School in Tunapuna because of her dreadlocks. Archbishop Edward Gilbert would intervene, overruling the nun who had barred the student from entering the school.
Should any school in the 21st century of Trinidad and Tobago be telling any OJT teacher that you can't wear a hijab because we're a Hindu school, or this child can't come to this Catholic school because he's a Rastafarian?
Could you go into CNC3 with the brand of the competitor and it's okay to work and come on television as the anchor with that brand?
I don't think that's a fair comparison.
It is.
I pose the same question to the moderator of the Presbyterian Synod.
The Concordat reminds us that religious bodies play a very integral role in the society because of their moral and spiritual and even, the values education that we teach in our institutions.
But is there any place in our society where a Catholic school can tell a Rastafarian child, or a Hindu school can tell a Muslim child or teacher, OJT teacher, that they can't come to their school because of their hairstyle or because of a hijab?
Oh, not at all. The Concordat has nothing to do with indoctrination. The Concordat has nothing to do with forcing or coercing a child to abandon their religion.
But it is on the basis of the Concordat that we've gone to court and we've lost. And when I say we, I mean the public of Trinidad and Tobago in some instances have gone to court and lost on these grounds of the Concordat, that these denominational boards, the denominational boards like you oversee, can and do have a case.
Well, whenever there is an arrangement or an agreement or maybe a memorandum of understanding between two parties, there's always the expectation of benefits on both sides.
Dr. Gupta emphasized how the Constitution and the Concordat can often come face to face.
You have touched on a very sensitive issue there. And the Constitution protects the rights of the individual. And that is very clear. Every individual has the right, certain rights. But those rights are circumscribed by other rights and other privileges. If you want to attend a Hindu school, there are certain conditions before you enter the school, and you know them well. So you can't enter the school and then say, I want to wear a hijab, if that is not allowed in the uniform of the school. The law may take a different stand.
For the last 60 years, there are those who have continued to test how far the length of the law would reach, like Kamla Jagisa in 2012. Jagisa, a Hindu, challenged the Teaching Service Commission's decision to abide by the Presbyterian Board's objection to her becoming principal. She had acted in the position. The board cited paragraph 4 of the Concordat. She lost the case, with Justice Sebastian Vento citing in his judgment, the assisted schools are the property of the respective denominational bodies. These bodies have a constitutionally protected right to the enjoyment of their property. It stands to reason that whoever is appointed to teach in these schools must therefore affect the right of the denominational bodies to the enjoyment of their property. Any such appointment should be made subject to the approval of the owners of the property. The very day, Satmaraj called an impromptu press conference hailing the decision as history-breaking. It would be continually referenced in the decade that followed.
That case between Kamla Jagisa and the Teaching Service Commission came about. It was reaffirmed that the relationship between denominational boards and the state must be maintained because it brought about a partnership in education.
But giving some people an advantage because of their religion, be it student or teacher, does not sit well with Dr. Claudius Fergus.
It cannot be right in a society that is founded on a constitution that guarantees education for all and that has an Equal Opportunities Commission that they are conscious of the fact that there is discrimination in the society that needs to be eliminated. Most of those are relics of colonialism.
The system starts off with an unhappy bias. It's a bias that gets me infuriated.
In the tug-of-war that now takes place with the Concordat, Archbishop Gordon feels the country is directing its focus to the wrong issue.
Is that exam at 11 years old the adequate instrument for determining where a child studies? And that's the second real problem that we have. I think it's a terrible instrument. In fact, I think it's abuse. I mean, I think of myself at 11 years old. It took me 2 years to figure out how to get past what happened to prepare for that exam.
The Concordat has made victims and villains of people with a continuous cycle of blame on both sides of the divide. Coming up after the break.
When we spend time throwing stones at each other, we just end up with a lot of people getting hit and we're not moving forward.
We address the need for state schools to raise the bar and get a glimpse into the conclusions of the cabinet-appointed committee to review the Concordat. Throughout its 62-year history, there have been multiple attempts from multiple governments to review and recommend how the nation moves forward with the Concordat. At the Ministry of Education Secondary Entrance Assessment National Consultation last June, Anthony Rochford, the acting school supervisor at the Division of Education, Research and Technology from the Tobago House of Assembly, outlined several Concordat and educational plans and policies the country have had since independence. It started with the Maurice Plan, then moved to the 15-year Education Plan. By 1985, there was an Education Plan. Through the 90s, there was a White Paper Plan. In 1996, former Prime Minister Bastio Pandey commissioned an internal report on the placement of common entrance examination. 2 years later, a task force was set up for the removal of the common entrance examination. In 2002 came the Education Plan, while the establishment of the Vision 2020 operational plan 5 years later would see the government sign an MOU with the denominational boards agreeing to foot the bill of repairs of assisted schools. In 2011, there was a strategic plan, while in 2017 there was an educational plan. It brings us to this current cabinet-appointed committee which is reviewing the secondary entrance assessment and the Concordat. I reached out to chairman of the committee, Professor Jerome Delisle, requesting an interview on the committee's report. He declined our request, saying the Ministry of Education appears uncomfortable with the contents without the report being formally submitted. However, we were able to get a glimpse into the committee's work. Reverend Joy Abdul Mohan represented the interreligious organization on the committee.
I think several things that we did discover, though, is that the Concordat is really not the issue, you know. It's parental guidance, parenting, teacher training, and just basic respect for the differences we share.
Whether pro or anti-Concordat, both sides of the divide agree there is an urgent need to arrest the decline of state schools.
The arrangement that we have now of better schools, or best schools, or top schools, or what I call schools that have the gold standard, is blinding us from doing that overall assessment and reorientation of our school system in order to cater for everybody in the school system. Equal opportunity for all.
The solution to the problem of the Concordat is for the government to raise the quality of more of their schools. They have the money. We don't, you know. They have the full budget. Raise the quality of more of the schools and then communicate to the national public the quality of the schools that they have raised.
Archbishop Jason Gordon says once the standard of state schools is raised, it will dispense of the term prestige schools.
Now, many people go on a brand, but if I was living in Sandy Grande, I wouldn't want my child leaving Sandy Grande at 4:30 in the morning to get into Port of Spain to go to school. But the brand drives that. Sandy Grande should have a school as good as any school in Port of Spain. And Arima and San Fernando and QREP as good as. And once the quality of the schools are raised, then people are not going to be pushing to get into the denomination schools anymore.
There are differing views on how the country can arrive at a system where both state and denominational schools are on par in delivering effective education. In fact, both sides are pulling in opposite directions. You're asking the government to take complete control of the school system when the statistics at the moment show that, quite in fact, the success comes from more what we would term these prestige schools, these denominational schools. You know, somebody might say that you have it, you know, upside down.
If we hold to the theme that these prestige schools do in fact provide a quality education for children, I would say they're doing that for about 2,000 kids. So what about the other 18,000? Where are they, and where is our caring for them?
On the contrary, Reverend Abdul Mohan wrote in the Presbyterian newsletter in August 2022, if parents wish to send their children to denominational schools because they are efficiently managed, then the state may need to consider giving the denominational boards more schools to manage as a pilot project. It's not a new idea. It was floated by the late Sanatan Dharma Mahasabha General Secretary Sat Maharaj in the 80s. Why do you think, and how do you think denominational boards can turn around state schools?
All right, maybe I could point out one issue that is really plaguing the country, and that's school violence. Administratively, how the leaders in the denominational schools treat with students, treat with teachers, and the programs that are offered within the schools to curtail such violence. As I said, the methodologies of the holistic education, we can perhaps apply them to the state schools. I'm not saying they're not there, but maybe it's not there enough.
Why did the government privatize electricity or the generation of electricity? Why are they looking to privatize WASA? Why? Because they realize that's not their core business and they don't do it very well. Well, why not privatize education? And by that, all I'm proposing is this, that there's something that the denominational schools have brought to Trinidad and Tobago. And in all the critics of Concordat and so, that does not come out. Take the denominational schools out of Trinidad and Tobago, and we would be 30 to 50 years behind where we are right now.
But Sharon Mangru points to a challenge that is often overlooked in state-run schools.
What is the greatest challenge in getting state schools up to the standard of quote-unquote prestige schools?
I taught at a senior comprehensive school. Right? To me, the one big challenge is the size of the school. The number of students that you have in the school, the number of students and teachers. One advantage that the denominational schools have is that they're relatively small. We do have one or two large ones. They're relatively small, and so it's easy. We build in on a historical culture, but there is also the interaction among the teachers and between the teachers and the students.
Mangru now wants a more targeted approach to education in the country.
But we need to start not doing the same thing across the board for everybody, going to look at who needs more. What do people need and provide for that need?
Dr. Primnath Gupta says denominational schools have an extra layer of accountability that makes all the difference. Before accounting to supervisors at the ministry level, their principals must first account to the denominational boards.
There's more accountability in the church-run schools. The schools are accountable. The principals are accountable to the Secretary of Education in the boards. The boards oversee what is happening.
But that doesn't help our education system. That just helps denominational school system.
No, it helps.
And you
no, you cannot say
but you were,
that.
But you were a principal.
Yeah.
You were a principal, so...
The education system is a total. You can't say that it doesn't help the education system. It is almost half of the education system. It pulls up the education system. It holds the standard. It's a signal standard for education. What we see in the denominational schools is the standard for education in this country. If you take that away from the system is going to collapse.
With part of the educational system already caving in, Dr. Olabisi Kuboni says it is imperative the government and denominational boards rekindle their relationship, and that should not include the Concordat.
So I think that not that churches should move out of the way in terms of their involvement in the education sector, but I think that we need a reorientation of the relationship between the church and the state in as far as the running and the management of the education sector is concerned. And in order to do that, I think in the first instance, what we now know as the Concordat should be put aside.
There is a perception that denominational boards are only after the good of their own schools as opposed to the good of all schools. But Reverend Abdul Mohan says given the violence plaguing some state schools and the low success rate, denominational boards must understand there are long-term consequences for the country as a whole.
How important is it that denominational heads also consider what is happening outside of their schools?
Very good questions, and I think we all have to be concerned because our hearts are broken when we see what's happening in the state schools. And our congregations are made up of a diverse population of children who go to denominational schools and children who go to state schools. And our concern, therefore, must go beyond the four walls of the church. And I'll give you an example.
The Concordat has caused a divide in the country where different perspectives are now struggling to meet at a common point.
It cannot be relevant. The Concordat has no place in our society that the Constitution guarantees equal rights to everyone. It cannot have a place. It had no place in the architecture of independence either. So it cannot have a role to play today. And I wish that the government would have the political will to eliminate the Concordat from the education system.
For some, the end of the education system starts with the Concordat. For others, it's an argument that has had the country going in circles for 60 years.
How critical is it that we find that other solution that you speak of and we stop talking about 20% and Concordat and secondary entrance assessment exam?
I think we are reaching a point in our history where we cannot continue to live as if we are in colonial times. And I think you're seeing a lot of other things happening. A lot of other colonial systems are breaking down. And maybe we need to take in front. Before the system breaks down irretrievably, let us look at what we want it to be and put in place something that we want rather than what we're left with by default. You know, it's not just the Concordat, it's the entire education system that I am not making this up. Any day you read a mention of education in the newspaper, and this has been for years, right? People talk about the education system is outdated, that we need to do something else. What is the something else that we need to do? If every time we try to do something else, you say, no, we have to go back. What is it we really want? And so there has to be opportunity for people to examine ourselves, see what do we want, what do we really want for our children and for our nation.